Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. My name is Skaya. The president of Serbia is on a 5-day official state visit to China, underscoring the growing depth of ties between Belgrade and Beijing as both sides look to expand cooperation across infrastructure, energy, and industrial investment. My guest on TVP World here is Tomasz Kasprowicz, editor-in-chief of Publica, Nowa. Tomasz, thanks for being with us here on World Talks this evening. All right, so let me ask you this. I mean, this is Vucic's first state visit to China, correct me if I'm wrong, as president of Serbia. Chinese officials have made clear their significance that they're attaching to it, but I want to hear it from you. They're exchanging views on bilateral relations, on shared international and regional concerns. What exactly, I want to know, are their shared concerns? I mean, why make a trip for 5 days to China?
Well, there are many answers to this question, and we have to unpack it from different sides.
Please do.
From the point of view of Serbia, it's important because Serbia is trying to balance between various actors and trying to be outside of the grip of European Union. In principle, Serbia is still a candidate to European Union, but in practice, this enlargement part is not working at all. Traditionally, Russia was a patron state of Serbia that was keeping it outside of the pressure of EU, at least to some part, so that Vucic could create its state that is to a large degree a quasi-authoritarian state, and the pressure to increase democratization and pluralism in politics that is coming from EU could be ignored largely due to support from Russia. Of course, for the last several years, there is a problem with Russian support because Russia has bigger problems and bigger concerns on its own. So Vucic is looking for other parties that can, let's say, balance the pressures from EU. On the other side, China sees Serbia as one of the countries that can give its foothold into the Europe. Recent change in power in Hungary makes Chinese stance a little bit more complicated. So far, Hungary was a very good partner to China, and it was a foothold to European Union. Now this will be changing to a degree, so the Serbia is next best thing, taking into consideration all of the tensions that are between European Union and China recently.
Tomasz, let me ask you this. How do you view the fact that there's massive protests still taking place, right, in Serbia? And here you have the president on a trip to China. I mean, how do you think that's being viewed?
Well, first of all, those protests are going on for quite a while now, many months. So basically, Vucic would have to stay at home for a whole time and do not leave Serbia at all for a long time. So that's probably not feasible. Those protests are a clear indication that the regime of Vucic is weakening, and we may see a change at power during the next elections. This is, of course, difficult because Vucic has been in power for so long that the state is basically captured, and the protesters have a hard time forming a coherent political front. This, however, may change, and as we've seen in Hungary, even a multi-year state capture can be overcome when the populace is unhappy with the politicians enough. And this seems to be a case in Serbia, looking at all of the protests of what started as protests of students going around the country and gaining more and more support elsewhere. This is a big problem for Vucic, but he decided to try to wait until all of the protests will die out because of the fatigue. However, what we see right now is that the fatigue is not setting in that much. We may assume that these protests are of concerns to Vučić and his continued power, and he might be looking for some reassurance from China that in case he's taking even stronger stance against the protests, this will not be a problem for Chinese, and he will have a support from China, because of course EU is not looking well on how those protests are dealt with. Of course, the protesters would like much harder stance from the EU. And they look a little bit on European partners as traitors due to very, let's say, lukewarm pressures on Vučić. This is mostly because EU decided that Vučić is less of the evils, and he's providing some sort of stability in the region. Whether that is true or not is debatable, of course, and let's hope that the outlook in EU on the matter will change.
Tomasz, you mentioned a lot of important factors there. I want to first ask you about this. You did mention Russia. How do you think that Serbia still balances its relationships with China and Russia while still trying to maintain ties with the West and, and EU aspirations?
Well, as I said, the EU aspirations are mostly dead for two reasons. First of all, accession to EU would require reforms of the country that would basically undermine the regime of Vučić. He cannot do it because then he will lose economic influence and then very shortly after that power. As I also mentioned, the opposition is less and less inclined positively towards EU due to very lukewarm support for it. Still, EU is so popular in the general society that neither party will directly say that Serbia is no longer seeking the membership. Also, what is not less important, there is still a flow of money and investment coming from EU, which cannot be at this point replaced by neither Russia nor China. So EU is of the paramount importance to Serbia, however, not necessarily from the point of view of political changes and reforms. So far, Russia was the backup. As we've mentioned, Russia is losing foothold almost everywhere. So the China that was also present before quite heavily in Serbia is taking even a stronger hold there. The stronger the hold of China, the further is the outlook on EU accession. That is very, very unlikely at this point anyway, but this can make it a permanent stance, take into consideration that the economy of Serbia is very concentrated in the hands of oligarchs, and of course a large outflow of migrants from Serbia that are looking for better life and better economic outlook elsewhere, mostly in European Union.
What do we know about Chinese investments in Serbia, and if it's fruitful, can you tell us about what it tells us, what that means about China's broader strategy that it has in Europe?
Well, what we've seen so far is that what some European countries counted on when accepting Chinese investment is knowledge transfer and technology transfer. The best case study for this is, of course, the battery factories in Hungary. But this shown over the years that basically Chinese create completely separate environment, economic environment, and do not cooperate with local companies almost at all. So they are basically a bubble within the company that is working within its own infrastructure, very heavily, of course, with other Chinese companies in the mainland, and not communicating very much and not transferring the knowledge, not transferring the technology. So something that Chinese did very well in the past while accepting the foreign direct investments, the Central Europe cannot cannot copy that because Chinese are very good at guarding their technology from them. Any sort of investment is, of course, welcomed, especially in Serbia, that is not in a good economic shape for years right now. But this is not yielding the profits they would like. However, at the same time, China is very keen on increasing their foothold and increasing their influence on all of the most important technologies and resources in those companies in order to make sure that in case of change of power, political power, it's very hard to limit the influence of Chinese in those countries. There is also counting in by Chinese that by moving those factories in Europe, they will be having much easier time infiltrating European common market and transferring surplus production from China. And we know they have a big problem with surplus production in many industries right now, especially the car industry. And they are looking for places they can sneak in this production. This, of course, is resisted right now, but not in a very hard way by the European Union. We remember the case of tariffs levied on the cars, but Chinese are looking for the ways of somehow putting a stamp made in Europe so that they can redirect their production here.
Wow, Tomasz. Let me ask you this now. I mean, it's been quite a busy month for China, the month of May, right? First, we have a visit by the U.S. President Donald Trump. A couple of days later, China hosts Russian President Vladimir Putin. And now we have Serbia's President, Aleksandar Vučić. What does this tell us about China's ambitions and China's goals? And if you can just compare these probably three meetings and sum it up into one. I see you smiling there. I see that you want to give me an answer.
Oh yeah, of course we cannot put those three visits on the same line because, of course, the Russian and U.S. visit was far more important for the Chinese, and you can quite clearly see the difference on how those presidents were welcomed in China. And the Chinese are very good at showing the level of importance by the way they invite the guests. So clearly Donald Trump was the most important guest, and the preparation of the whole visit was very well thought through. The visit of Putin was far less glamorous, which was a big problem for Russian propaganda. Even Dmitry Peskov was saying that we shouldn't judge those visits by whatever surrounding events are there, only by the merit. Well, even if we judge those visits by the merit, still the American visit was far more important. Of course, Serbian visit is a nuance from the point of view of Chinese. The only important part is that again, Serbia is seen as the most possible probable foothold in Europe for the Chinese right now after the change of power in Hungary. Still, we clearly see that mostly this visit is self-organized. Vučić went to the Great Wall on his own. So this is partially, I would say, tourist visit and partially state visit. Of course, he will meet with Xi Jinping and Chinese Prime Minister, which shows that the Chinese look at this visit as an important one, but of course is far less important than the previous two. However, these last weeks are a great time for Chinese diplomacy. They can represent themselves, and they do. Represent China as a place where everybody goes, that can talk with everybody, that is bringing some kind of diplomacy, dialogue, and possible brokerage of deals between the parties that don't really talk to each other. So that's why those two visits, especially Trump and Putin, are important ones, and it's definitely a message for the global South to show that there is a growing importance of China, that China is becoming the focal point of world relations. Whether it's entirely true or not, that remains to be seen, but clearly the importance of China on the international stage is rising, especially after the US debacle in Iran, where the position of US was clearly highly diminished. Of course, the Serbian visit is not completely without its importance. When you look at what the Chinese are saying, is that they look as they show Serbia as one sensible European state that is not looking at China and relations from China with China as something that is to be completely based on current politics. So this is also important, but of course not as important as the previous two.
Thank you so much, Tomasz Kasprowicz, editor-in-chief of the Publica Nowa, for all your input here with us on World Talks. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
And that's all for this episode of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.